I love the story of a courtroom where there was a high-profile doctor of psychology who was called to the stand, and she was definitely a hostile witness to the prosecution. And the prosecutor walked up, and she was sort of an icy, cold, professional, everything in place kind of person, kind of woman. And when as the prosecutor came up to her, she just glared at him. And he said, "Would you share with us your name?" And she glared back at him, and she backed her chair on the witness stand up. And what she didn't see was that the back legs of her chair were precariously close to the end of the witness stand. And she glared at him, and she folded her arms across her chest, cocked her head, and she leaned back, and before she could answer the question about her name, she catapulted backward, not head over heels, but heels over head, into the boxes behind and some recording equipment, and everybody in the room just froze. She was able to extricate herself from the rubble that she had created. She stood up and she refixed her disheveled dress, and she took time to redo her disheveled hair. She put the chair back up on the witness stand. She proudly got back up and glared at everybody out there as if to say, "Don't you dare smirk at me." She sat back in the chair. Now, the prosecuting attorney did not miss a beat. He had the same expression as when he began. He said, "Well, doctor, we could begin with an easier question." What is your name? Well, there are times in our life where we are called to testify, sometimes in a courtroom, but oftentimes, more often, we are called to testify about what God has done in our life, what He is doing in our life. And sometimes we make this much more difficult than it really needs to be. We are looking at what we're calling our life vision statement, and you can see it on these 6 banners around the room, that by God's grace to step forward as God's man or woman in my spheres of influence to serve His purposes, which we are looking at today, and next week we'll finish up with for His glory. God's primary purpose is the redemption of human nature. This is the great overlay that God puts on this life that He is accomplishing while we are sort of madly scrambling through trying to manage our life. And there are a few things here that how can we serve His purposes? I'd like to try to be very practical today and give you some ideas on this. The first one has to do with testimony, sharing our faith story. And as I mentioned, sometimes we make this way harder than it really needs to be. Acts 1:8 says, "You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to all the parts of the earth." In the past years, we've done some training about writing a 3-minute testimony. We've done about writing a 1-minute testimony. We've done some training about a 1-sentence testimony. And today I'd like to just, as I shared last week, some 3-word testimonies that were on Instagram. Grace not deserved. Freed from crack. God hears me. I'm still standing. Free at last, held in love. Now I see. Work in progress. I forgive you. Delivered from deception. He never leaves. He renewed me. He's my home. God had mercy. My real Father. From Islam to Jesus. Atheists no more. God never left. Lost and found, saved by grace. I woke up because He lives, free from lust, and one of my humorous favorites, Chick-fil-A. Now, when I think about, oftentimes, it's sort of that 3-word testimony that kind of fits in many conversations we have with people. And it really is just your story, your unique story. You might even be thinking at this moment, if I was writing a 3-word testimony about my life, What has God done in me? What is Jesus doing in my life now? What would that be? Now, the great thing about a testimony is it's yours. Nobody can really argue your testimony, your story. They may not like Jesus, they may not like the Bible or Christianity, but they cannot refute your experience with testimony. I am reminded of a different court scene. This was in a very rural town in southern Mississippi, a very small town. And there was two very rookie attorneys, prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney. And the prosecuting attorney decided to call up a woman by the name of Mrs. Jones. She was a grandmotherly type, had lived there, that little town, all her life. And Mrs. Jones came to the stand. She was sworn in, and the prosecuting attorney, because he was a rookie, asked her this question. Mrs. Jones, do you know me? And she said, I've known you, Mr. Williams, since you were a boy, that you've always been a liar and a cheat. I know you've cheated on your wife. And you gossip about people when they're not around. You're hard to get along with. And you're not smart enough to realize that you'll never be more than a 2-bit paper pusher in this state. Yes, Mr. Williams, I know you. Well, the poor rookie prosecutor staggered physically and was reeling emotionally. And he happened to turn around to try to figure out what he was going to do. And he made eye contact with the defense attorney. And the defense attorney had a brief moment of fear in his eyes, which gave the prosecutor an idea. He said, Mrs. Jones, pointed at the defense attorney, do you know the defense attorney? And Mrs. Jones said, I certainly do. I've also known him since he was a boy. He's always been lazy, a bigot, cheated on his wife with at least 3 women that I know of, including your wife. And he's got the worst legal practice in the state. Yes, I know Mr. Howard. Now, the judge had heard enough. He interrupted, and he called the 2 attorneys up to the bench. And they walked up to the bench, and then he motioned them to come as close as they could. And he leaned over as far as he could, and he whispered to these 2 rookie attorneys, if either of you idiots ask Mrs. Jones if she knows me, I will throw both of you to the electric chair. Do we have an understanding? Testimony. Your testimony does not need to be like Mrs. Jones with the people that you're talking to. Matthew 28:19 is the Great Commission. As you are going, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you, or to obey everything I've commanded you, and the Lord is with you always. Those are our marching orders. And one of the things that's really sort of odd to me about Christianity is that part of the growth of Christianity depends upon the raw material of people like you and me. I don't know if I ever would have made that decision if I'd been in God's place, but for some reason that made sense to him. Romans 10 talks about this. How can they call on the one they have not believed in? How can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? How can they hear without someone telling them? It's not like the gospel happened and God writes John 3:16 up in the clouds, or sends angels like he did on the night of Christ's birth. He uses garden variety people like you and me, screwed up people, broken people, yet beloved, who are still in process of God working in our life to make that bridge to lost people. Now, how does that happen? Partly through our testimony, partly, as we looked at last week, the metaphor of salt and light. You are the salt of the earth. If salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salt again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, salt is a metaphor that usually with preserving meat or food for a long period of time, but it's also the only spice I really like. We have a cabinet full of spices. And there's only one that I go to. It's the salt shaker. And to me, salt makes something tastier. Now, that's the imagery that Paul uses in Colossians 4. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Outsiders means lost people. People who are outside of the church, don't consider themselves a Christian, really don't value the things of God that much. Make the most of every opportunity. So how do we do that? Well, he says, let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. And what he's talking about is sort of a combination of our words and our attitude or tone. So with our words, it might be, are we known at work or in your community as somebody that's kind, that's encouraging? Or are you known as somebody who's sarcastic and critical, judgmental, gossiping about people? Our words. And then our attitude. Is there a thing of gratitude about your work environment and the people that you're around, in spite of the difficulties of life at work or in your own life? That's salt. That makes a difference with people. Something stands out to you, about you, when that happens. The second metaphor is light. You are the light of the world. The light of the world. Light has its great function in the midst of darkness. And darkness is defeated when you turn on a light switch. Light is a metaphor for truth. And here the idea is that you and I have been privileged with the truth of the Scripture. And God is working that truth slowly into our character, slowly changing our nature. And we little by little are embodying and living out that truth in our lives. And what that does, he says here, is it creates light for, as Isaiah talked about, the people who walk in darkness. For the first 20 years of my life, I walked in darkness, even though I thought I was a Christian, and even though our family had gone to church virtually every week. But I was no more Christian than the pew that I sat in every week. Because at the core of who I was me. And I thought I knew how to live my life. I had the power. I had control. I knew what I needed. And I just assumed that I could get it. Until my junior year, as you all have heard my story. 2 Corinthians 4:5. What we preach is Jesus as Lord, with ourselves as your servant. So here, what Paul talks about here is the combination of our words, what we say, our faith story, our testimony, and serving. And here I think about just simple little things. Like if at your work, do you have a workroom? Periodically in a workroom, what you should do is get a dozen donuts and take them and put them in there. Just put a little sign that says, take one. And maybe put your name on it. Or bagels, that might be simple. Or you get a simple flower arrangement for your workroom. Or a simple flower arrangement or potted plant for somebody in the office who's going through a tough time. I was thinking about you this weekend, and I just want to encourage you with something like that. Or maybe you get somebody like me, a $20 gift card to a coffee place. Again, it's just something small, but it's a way of serving the people, and it's a way of being light. We embody the light in a dark world. Matthew 5:41, Jesus gives another example which was stunning in that world. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. So in that day, Rome was the power there in Israel, and the Roman soldiers had the authority that if they wanted somebody to carry their armor a mile, they could just take anybody they wanted, and they were forced to carry that guy's armor for a mile. Jesus said, no. If that happens to you, as one of God's followers, volunteer to go a 2nd mile. You think, why would anybody do something like that? That sounds absolutely stupid. It is so unintuitive. Unless you see this is an opportunity to be salt and light to that person, that soldier that's asking you to do this. And that salt and light comes through your attitude of response. Jesus says, go with them 2 miles. Volunteer to do that. Well, so we have so far our faith story and ways of being salt and light and service. The third thing I'd like to talk about, the power of example in the life of the believer. Galatians 5:22, 23, very familiar verses about the fruit of the Spirit. For the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And one of God's marketing tools that he uses in trying to reach lost people is his work in you and me. And in one sense, what he's doing in us puts Jesus on display. For example, as you've heard my story before many times, I went to a Christian retreat when I was 20, assuming I was a Christian, and I saw about 200 other college students there. And over the course of about 15 or 20 minutes, two things just about knocked me over. These students had an inner joy about them that just seemed to come from inside and made its way out in their countenance, their attitude, the way they sang the songs that we were singing. And what struck me is that my approach to life was exactly the opposite. My approach to life was to find some source of joy out here and grasp it and hope that I could put it in here and it would last. And that would be like being a very good athlete or a student or wanting to be a doctor, being involved in a fraternity, a party guy, trying to date girls. Trying to impress the professors. I had a whole slew of these things looking back, that I was trying to find some moments of joy, grab them, put them in here. But the problem that I began to realize my junior year, those things never lasted long enough. And they didn't go deep enough. My mind was swirling as I was thinking about this. While everybody was singing songs, I just thought, how are you living your life? On what basis do you think that life is going to be what you want it to be? You can keep going thinking you know what to do, you know what your needs are, and you think you can do it. But as life gets harder, are you going to do any better at this? Are you going to be any smarter than you are now? And I looked at these Christians and I thought, it sort of made me mad in a way. How can they have this inner joy and they aren't doing half the stuff I do? About that time, the second thing hit me as I'm observing these students singing, and that was there's just this, I sensed an inner peace that they had inside that again made its way out into their countenance in the way they sang songs. And what struck me about this sense of inner peace was something like, this is how I sort of thought of this. This is who I am, and I'm okay with that. And what struck me was, I'm not like that at all. I am scrambling every day with these different things out here to try to do something that I can grab hold of and put it in here and answer that question about, I'm okay with who I am, to where it lasts and goes deep enough. And that set me again on about 15 minutes of what are you doing with your life? And what strategy are you using? You're using, Seth, the outside to inside strategy. Is it working? And I had been going through several months, unbeknownst to anybody, of this growing sense of emptiness. While outwardly, everybody thought, Seth's got it together. He knows what he's doing. Or am I going to do this inward to outward strategy where God is doing something in me that I cannot produce myself? Now, what was so striking to me was that what was happening was these students were just singing songs. But the number 2 and number 3, fruit of the Spirit, were evident in their life. This inner joy and this inner peace. Without knowing it, probably, they were putting Jesus on display to somebody like me. And it grabbed my attention. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, Paul gives an example in his life when he started a church in the city of Thessalonica. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We work night and day while we preach the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God. And then notice the two categories of things where he puts Jesus on display. The first is his character. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. There was something solid about his character that stood out to these people, that was different from the hazy, shaky, shady character of people around them. For you know how we dealt with each of you. And now besides his character, the second thing is remember how we related to you. Again, putting Jesus on display. As a father deals with his own children. He's talking about his attitude, his tone, his relationship. Encouraging, comforting, urging you to live lives worthy of God who calls you to his kingdom and glory. If you are a genuine Christian, wherever you go, you may not ever think about this, but you are putting Jesus on display through your character, through the work that God's doing in your heart, and the way that you converse and relate to people. Isaiah 61:1 on the next page of your outline. We looked at this last week, but I want to go through it again. And I want to really personalize this passage. Jesus quoted this prophecy, spoken about 800 years before he lived. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. Now, that's true. But how does that happen today? Well, part of the way that happens is he needs some mouthpieces, like you and me. Again, he's just not writing this up in the clouds. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. This is a different kind of heart surgery, heart transplant. Now, as Jesus is doing this work in people's lives, he hands some of these tools in the surgery room to you and to me. You might be a physician's assistant. You might be a nurse in there. But you're engaged with him in this with people that you work with. To bind up the brokenhearted. You are his hands and feet, as we've said. To proclaim freedom for the captives. In our world, we always hear about fentanyl. We hear about drug abuse and alcohol abuse. The kind of things that captive us, Satan captivates or captures us, sexual abuse. Release from the darkness. And here I think about the metaphor of depression and despair and loneliness and emptiness. He uses you and I to come alongside as audio-visual expressions of what he is doing in the life. We partner with him. Your role matters. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. That's not just a theological statement. And it's not just something that God does by himself. Sometimes he does that. But oftentimes he uses folks like you and me to come alongside people and comfort them. Comfort those who mourn. Provide for those who grieve in Zion. And then I want you to think about, use your imagination for a moment. I want you to think about, it's Monday morning. You just woke up. And you're sort of grumpy. Time to go to work. A new work week starts. You go to the bathroom. You turn on the light. You look in the mirror. And if you're like me, you go, oh, what happened? And you just go through the motions of getting ready. And you walk out the door to begin your work week. Think about what Jesus wants to do in our life. For those who grieve in Zion. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes. Imagine tomorrow morning you've taken a shower, you're blow drying your hair, and suddenly next to you Jesus is standing with you, and on your grumpy attitude he places a crown. A crown of beauty, he says, instead of ashes, the things that you're thinking about how you screwed up. As you ladies are putting on your makeup, as we guys are putting on our cologne. He says he bestows an oil of joy instead of mourning. Imagine what would happen as you stood at your sink with these metaphors. And a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Instead of putting on your dress or your power suit or the suit that you wear to work, what if you had, with your imagination, that he's putting on a garment of praise? This is not just theological truth. This is what God is doing in us. And he uses these things here to put him on display, as we'll see. They will be called oaks of righteousness. You may think of yourself as just this weak little tree sapling, hoping that it will withstand just a little wind. A planting of the Lord. And he finishes all of this with, for the display of his splendor. This is what he's doing in us, whether we're aware of it or not. But we have the opportunity to enter into our world, our work world, very differently than before. In John 9, there was a man born blind, and the disciples are going, "Oh, Jesus, how did this happen? Did his parents sin? Did he sin? How did this happen?" And his response in verse 3 is, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." You hear what he's saying there? We would look at that and say, "Oh, that's unfair that guy, he's been dealt a bad hand." And certainly with that disability, that's difficult. Not saying it's not difficult. But do you see the bigger picture that Jesus is telling these guys about this man born blind in John chapter 9? There's something here that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is today, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. He says, you and I are in this together. Putting Jesus on display here in a situation with a man who's had a disability. Romans 9:17, the same idea. Scripture says to Pharaoh, "I raised you up for this very purpose." I'm sure Pharaoh never thought this way. "That I might display my power in you." The same word, display. My power in you, that my name be proclaimed in all the earth. You and I serve his purposes through what we say, through our service, our actions, our attitudes, our tone of voice, even the character that God is building in our lives. And then the last thing I want to mention is we display, divine love is on display relationally. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. These are the top two commands, and they are important. Paul in 1 Timothy 1:5 says the goal of his teaching, in verse 5, is love that issues from three things: a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. As we looked at prior to this, Jesus says the people will know that he is real by our love for other people. And in John 17, as we've looked at prior, that the kind of love that we are to put on display with each other is very different from the kind of the world talks about love. The world's love is basically this: first me, then you. And we're so sweet and kind when we say that, and when that's our attitude. And the kind of love that God's trying to do us is in your marriage, with your kids, with your parents, with your boss, with people at work. First you, then me. That is salt and that is light. You are putting Jesus on display when we love the way the Trinity loves. Through your faith story, through being salt and light, through serving, by the type of community that you build with other believers, puts Jesus on display. And by our example, even with our character. Let's pray together. Father, this is the great purpose of life that you are about. And sadly, for the first 20 years, I had no idea that this is what was going on. And why are we even here? Why did you create people? How am I supposed to live in a fallen world? And finally, at age 20, by some other Christians putting Jesus on display, you turned on the lights in my life. And I began to see life very differently from your point of view instead of just my point of view. And even though I didn't know much about this Jesus stuff and God being central in my life, I knew one thing, that the way I was living was a cul-de-sac. And the way that these Christians had discovered, they discovered something in their relationship with Jesus I didn't have and that I didn't need. And my life was not going to change because I was going to be smarter or wiser or more in control, because I was the problem. You needed to be the driver in my life. And by a simple act of surrender, I said to Jesus, before Carrie Underwood did, Jesus, you take the wheel of my life. And I'm so glad that he did. I would like to ask you, if you're either here or watching online, have you made that distinction? Are you living as if you know what to do and you know what your needs are and you can do it? You can take all those things outside of your life and stuff them inside of you and be just fine? Or are you having your eyes opened to realize that's a bad strategy for living? That's the strategy that lives to relational misery and emptiness and loneliness, depression, despair, anger, conflicts, hurt feelings. And maybe you're sick of that. And you finally realized the source of those is me, my nature. And my nature needs an overhaul. Join the club. And thankfully, God is a great mechanic. He's a great heart surgeon. He's a great driver. And he will take us with simple humility of saying, I am a sinner. Please forgive me. And he will take over and do the reconstruction and the redemption of your life and relationships and your character. Would you just simply say to Jesus, I need you. Please change me at the very core of who I am. Thank you for your forgiveness. Come into my life. Help me know how to let you be the driver.